This well-acclaimed book of Jared Diamond has an interesting title. At first, a reader might have no idea what Guns, Germs, and Steel is about. Generally, it's about the European colonization of the other parts of the world. Diamond wanted to know, why is it that the Europeans became invaders and not the Native Americans or Southeast Asians or Polynesians? On the surface, the answer lies with guns, germs, and steel. In the age of colonization, the colonizers used their expertise in the battlefield with swords and guns. Also, when they crossed the oceans via ships to their new colonies, they brought with them infectious diseases. Guns, germs, and steel, however, are only some of the many factors involved in colonization. In Part 1, Diamond started the quest for answers, starting from the Homo sapiens to the hunter-gatherers and to the Inca Empire. In Part 2, he discussed the importance of agriculture to societies. In Part 3, the development of infectious disease, writing, and technology are described in detail. It also includes the development of government and religion. Part 4 takes the readers to a travel around the world and back in time. The advancement of Europe is not caused by a single determinant only. Instead, many factors which are all related to each other are involved. By reading this book, something new will be learned about one's own nation. Furthermore, it will also change anybody's view of the world, no matter where he or she comes from. Yali's question: the regionally differing courses of history. In 1972, biologist Jared Diamond was studying the evolution of birds in New Guinea. As he was walking along the beach, he was joined by a local politician by the name of Yali. Diamond was impressed by Yali's upright character. They had a meaningful conversation sparked by Yali's curiosity. At that time, Papua New Guinea was still under Australia as designated by the United Nations. It was on its way to independence. Yali had the goal to organize his people towards self-government. In essence, he asked Diamond why white people had more resources than the locals of New Guinea. Diamond thought that this question can be extended further on why inequality exists throughout the world. Why is wealth and power so unevenly distributed among nations? Why are the indigenous people marginalized? He began to find answers back from the beginning of the great civilizations and to the modern nations of today. His findings are not only useful to Yali's people, but to all the other people of the world as well. From Eden to Cajamarca, up to the starting line. What happened on all the continents before 11,000 BC? To pinpoint when Europeans began to have a head start or a clear advantage over other civilizations, it is necessary to go back to the origin of human species, more especially in 11,000 BC, when continents have been populated by sophisticated humans. Scientists have traced our origins to the three great apes, namely the pygmy chimpanzee, common chimpanzee, and the gorilla. Their ancestral lines have split and developed to the species of proto-humans. This is sufficient evidence that these proto-humans only inhabited Africa and that they only spread through other parts of the world. The Homo erectus has only been half our brain, and the Homo sapiens only developed more slightly. Archaeologists have only excavated unpolished stone tools which prove that the early species cannot be considered as intelligent beings. The Neanderthals from Western Asia and Europe were not so much better. It was around 50,000 years ago that humanity took a great leap forward, as coined by Jared Diamond. Eurasia was a single continent then. Cro-Magnons were proven to have used sophisticated tools for hunting and fishing. Also noteworthy are their artworks, like the cave painting in southwestern France. Diamond favored the theory wherein humans came and spread out from one area, which is Africa, rather than from parallel developments with other regions like Indonesia and China. It was in Europe that the Cro-Magnons thrived and became localized. There were evidences that they were able to annihilate the Neanderthals who preceded them. Evidences of population in Australia and New Guinea were carbon dated to be 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. The aftermath of Ice Age demanded watercraft to be able to inhabit the distant islands, and our first humans were able to do so. It is a consequence of their arrival to Greater Australia that the large animals became extinct there. Giant kangaroos, birds, and reptiles, collectively called megafauna, did not survive the human conquest. Unlike in Africa and Eurasia, where the large animals evolved and learned to coexist with humans, the megafauna of Australia were devastated by the human conquest. Like the dodo bird of Mauritius, the megafauna were overkilled from hunting. There were experts who argued that climate change caused their extinction, but Diamond realized that their extinction happened everywhere, regardless if the ecosystem was wet or dry. This is the reason why there's not one domestic native animal in Australia and New Guinea, and their absence has a great impact to the region until now. And so, by that time, 3 out of the 5 continents were inhabited by humans. Only North and South America were left behind. This is attributed to the lack of complicated technology of boats to cross Siberia from Eurasia. Moreover, needles were not yet invented, which the early humans needed to create warm clothing against the cold. This need for warm clothes might be the reason for the extinction of woolly rhinoceros and mammoths in Eurasia. Thus, it was in 12,000 BC that Alaska was inhabited. Around 11,000 BC, archaeologists found polished stone tools in Clovis, New Mexico. In all 48 states southward towards Mexico, similar Clovis sites were discovered. Edmonton in Canada was also populated, especially in the Great Plain where there were abundant game. America at that time was very much like the African plains, where there are plenty of lions, horses, cheetahs, elephants, sloths, and camels. It was just that they were all hunted and killed, like in the case of Australia and New Guinea. Their remains have been found around the Grand Canyon. Mammoth skeletons were also discovered with spear points on their ribs. These cannot be attributed as well to climate change. Comparatively with other civilizations, Africa must have had a big head start. Since it was the cradle of human population, Africans must have developed the most advanced technology and way of life by now. However, this was never realized. A natural experiment of history. How geography molded societies on Polynesian islands. The process of scientific experiments cannot be applied to societies. That is why historians turn to natural experiments or events in the past which are similar and comparable. Diamond's research, which links geography as a major precursor of well-developed civilizations, can be best represented by the Polynesian Islands. There was a struggle for territory in 1835 between the Maori people from New Zealand and the Moriori people of the Chatham Islands. The Maori came with an army to conquer the islands and kill the natives. The Moriori did not fight back and instead offered peace and friendship. Although both groups are Polynesian, they are very different from one another. The Maori people are skilled farmers. They have more complex technology and political organization, while the Moriori people, on the other hand, were only hunter-gatherers and were not able to develop further. Their stark difference lies in geography. The Chatham Islands has a cold climate, which was not viable for cultivating crops. Thus, its inhabitants were restricted to hunter-gathering and produced no food surplus. The society cannot afford to have craftsmen, soldiers, and leaders who don't produce food. On the contrary, New Zealand has fruitful soil needed to support a society which can create art or monuments. Diamond proposed 6 variables which dictate the various lifestyles among the diverse Polynesian people. These are climate, geology, marine life, area, terrain, and isolation. Climate on most Polynesian islands are tropical because of proximity to the equator. In the majority of New Zealand, it is temperate, while on other parts, as well as in the Chatham Islands, the climate is cold and Antarctic-like. There is also a diverse geology. For instance, the Tuamotu archipelago is flat and barely above sea level. Henderson and Rennell Islands, on the other hand, are high above sea level, with high deposits of limestone. Also, there's a lack of fresh water supply and fertile soil. In New Zealand, there are abundant mineral resources like gold, jade, iron, and coal. Meanwhile, volcanic islands like Tonga have rich soil because of volcanic ashfall. Majority of the Polynesian islands have rich marine life because they're surrounded by coral reefs and shallow waters. However, in the rocky coasts of Pitcairn and Marquesas, there is less amount of seafood. Area is another factor for diversity. The Marquesas is fragmented by valleys and ridges. In contrast, Tonga has no hindrance for communication and travel because of its smooth terrain. The last factor, according to Diamond, is isolation. Chatham and Easter Islands are remote and relatively small compared to New Zealand, Hawaii, or Marquesas, where contact between islands became plausible. All of these 6 variables have great impact on the economic, social, political, and cultural structure of the Polynesian Islands. The geography of a specific location has shaped the lifestyle of its inhabitants. Economy in the Polynesia varied from fishing, hunting birds, and domestication of dog, chicken, and pig. But their main source of food is agriculture. In Hawaii, the people built complex irrigation systems for their taro fields. Other islands cultivated dry land crops like yams and sweet potatoes or tree crops such as banana and coconut. As a result of stable food subsistence, population began to grow. In Chatham Island, for example, there are only 5 people per square mile as compared to New Zealand with 28 people per square mile. Increased population density demanded social structure and political organization. Societies in Tonga, Samoa, and Hawaii were unified because of smooth terrain. 10,000 people connected because there were no steep valleys which would cause them to be isolated. Farmers produced sufficient food supply for everyone. That's why leaders, bureaucrats, priests, and warriors became free to excel in their fields. In Chatham Islands, people remained to be hunter-gatherers and there were no stonemasons, navigators, or tattooers. Their culture did not flourish. Chiefs in larger islands, meanwhile, ordered the commoners to build grand tombs, giant statues, temples, and feast centers. Meanwhile, the people of Chatham were only able to utilize stone tools. In the lands of South America, there was existence of various precious metals. Eurasians and Africans went on to master the use of iron. It may be deduced that if the islands were only given the chance to develop their culture more, they would have been empires. However, Polynesia only had 3,200 years before colonization, while their counterparts had 13,000 years to strengthen their societies. Collision at Cajamarca. How geography molded societies on Polynesian islands. A big population shift of the modern times happened when the Europeans conquered America, the New World, resulting in the wipeout of Native American civilization. Contact between Europe and America began when Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean islands, and it reached its peak in the downfall of Inca Empire. It was on November 16, 1532, when Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizarro defeated the sun god and emperor Atahualpa. The battle occurred in Cajamarca, Peru, where only 168 Spanish soldiers trampled the 80,000 men native army. The colonizers won the war amidst their ignorance of the terrain and the people, as well as their isolation from nearest reinforcements. Pizarro, mandate of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, held captive Atahualpa for 8 months. He promised freedom to the monarch in exchange for tons and tons of gold. Atahualpa commanded his subjects to acquire ransom, but in the end, he was executed by Pizarro. His imprisonment and death sealed the fate of Native America under the Europeans, but these eventualities did not happen in America alone. Colonization all over the world has the same history. Why did Pizarro win over Atahualpa and not the other way around? The answer to this question lies in several important factors. They are steel weapons, horses, guns, epidemics, ships, politics, and literacy. Pizarro's men swept the opponents with swords, lances, and daggers. The natives, on the other hand, were helpless with their clubs. The Spanish were also protected by chainmail and helmets. Moreover, their horses gave them a huge advantage. They rode down the Indians on foot and launched surprise attacks. Though eventually the Native Americans adapted to this fighting technique, they were still no match for the Europeans. The latter's expertise in cavalry warfare began with the domestication of horses way back in 4000 BC. Horses remained a vicious weapon internationally until the 20th century in the First World War. Meanwhile, guns replaced swords as main weapons in battle by the 1700s. Both rifles and horses played a major part in Hernan Cortez's invasion of the Aztecs. And so, repeatedly in history, a small number of Europeans on horseback were able to slaughter thousands and thousands of natives. Epidemics also played a big part in history. It was smallpox which plagued Atahualpa's rivals, making him the sole emperor. Spaniards would have had a harder time conquering a stronger and united Incan empire if not for smallpox. All infectious diseases were unknown to the Native Americans, causing them to be extremely vulnerable. Measles, typhus, influenza, and the bubonic plague came along with the arrival of the Europeans. In North America, the organized societies along the Mississippi River were annihilated by epidemic from 1492 until the 1600s. The Aboriginal Australians were also swept by infectious disease in 1788. Another reason why it was Pizarro and not Atahualpa who came to conquer lands is maritime technology. Europeans had built ships which took them across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. The ships were in turn backed by the central government of Spain, which financed and equipped the ships with staff and facilities. Political organization also took part in the downfall of the Inca Empire. When Atahualpa died, the whole society weakened and stopped fighting back. Crucial as well in conquest is the system of writing. The warfare of Europeans improved because of written accounts of past voyages to the Americas. Columbus's and Cortez's experiences spread widely and quickly across Europe, information which Atahualpa did not have on his foreign invaders. Unlike the Spaniards, the Indians had no clue whatsoever on the nature of their guests. Thus, they greeted the invaders with friendship. Montezuma, the great Aztec emperor, also fell fast into European hands. Not knowing any better, he thought that Hernán Cortés was a returning god. Montezuma welcomed Cortés and his army in his capital Tenochtitlan. The reason why all these advantages were readily available to Europe will be discussed further in the next chapters. The rise and spread of food production. Farmer power. How geography molded societies on Polynesian islands. The domestication of plants and animals has indirect effects in the guns, germs, and steel at the age of conquest. A series of processes and causations led societies from the hunting-gathering to the great empires. It is necessary to look back 11,000 years ago when food production began. Stable food supply is needed in building complex societies. Around that time, Eurasians began to select few edible species of plants like wheat and rice. In lands with fertile soil and nurturing climate, farming began. This caused certain societies to evolve from nomadic hunter-gatherers to sedentary farmers. Animals also played a great role in settlement of the people. Pigs, cows, and chickens provided a source of meat and protein. Sheep and goats produced milk and milk products like cheese, butter, and yogurt. The manure of these domesticated animals was used as fertilizers. Large ones like horses and water buffaloes were trained to pull plows and till the land. This system of production created food surplus and presented the necessity of long-term food storage. Because of this, some members of society became free of the responsibilities of food production. This surplus can afford to enable inhabitants to conquer other territories. Kings and bureaucrats rose, unlike in hunter-gatherer societies, which are egalitarian. Soldiers were able to master warfare, and artisans excelled in making weapons. Scribes chronicled events, and priests converted the natives. Domesticated plants also provided clothing like cotton, linen, and leather, as well as other materials like ropes and nets, while animals like horses, camels, and donkeys provided means of transportation. Soon, they were not only able to transport humans, but goods as well, through wagons, saddles, and sleds. The relationship of humans and horses developed to military advancement. Huns were able to invade the Roman Empire, and the Mongols conquered Asia and Russia because of skilled cavalry. However, the close contact between people and animals had a negative outcome. Germs that infected animals mutated and affected humans. Flu, measles, smallpox, and other infectious diseases began spreading. Civilizations with no histories of animal domestication suffered. The indigenous people of Australia, South America, Africa, and Polynesia were easily infected, killed, and invaded by the Europeans. History's haves and have-nots. How geography molded societies on Polynesian islands. Fundamental to the study of the history of food production is carbon dating. Remains of animals or plants that archaeologists find in their excavations must undergo this process to know their origins. In essence, carbon is absorbed by Earth's atmosphere from the cosmic rays. Plants acquire the carbon and pass it to herbivores, which are consumed also by carnivores. The decay of carbon occurs long after the plant or animal is dead. Carbon-12 decays every 5,000 years, and carbon-14 after 40,000 years. Hence, scientists calculate the age of the remains in laboratories through carbon-12-carbon-14 ratio. The question of how, when, and where did food production begin can be answered in three sources. First is in regions where native animals and plants grew independently. Second, the domestication of foreign food source. And third, the arrival of foreign farmers. Interestingly, there are 5 major regions where food production began locally and independently. They are the Fertile Crescent, Mesoamerica, Andes, Yellow, and Yangtze River Valley. Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia, or more commonly known as Middle East, has the earliest carbon-dated evidences of cultivation at around 8,000 BC. The civilization there grew wheat, olive, and pea. They also raised goats and sheep. In 7,500 BC, Chinese ancestors cultivated millet, rice, pigs, and silkworms around the Yellow River Valley and Yangtze River Valley. Mesoamerica, consisting of Mexico and other nearby areas, is abundant with squash, corns, and beans. Turkeys were also raised there about 3,500 BC. In the Andes or South America, potato originated, as well as guinea pigs and llamas. The abundance of the Fertile Crescent spread to other regions like Western Europe, Indus Valley, and Egypt. These regions have no indigenous plants or animals, but they were able to localize and domesticate them. Thus, in Western Europe, oat and poppy became abundant at around 6,000 to 3,500 BC. The civilization at the Indus Valley of India was able to grow eggplants and sesame. They also raised humped cattle as well in 7000 BC. In Egypt, at 6000 BC, sycamore and the local vegetable chufa were farmed. It is also where donkeys and cats originated. Ethiopia, meanwhile, has wheat and barley. Coffee bean is indigenous to Ethiopia, but it has spread all throughout the globe. However, in other regions, there are no native resources or evidences of adaptation of foreign crops. Instead, foreign people came, conquered, and cultivated the lands. Europeans, aided with their education and technological advancement, invaded and killed local hunter-gatherers, as with the fate of Indians of North America and the Aboriginals of Australia. Archaeologists have unearthed skeletons which were evidences of massive changes in population. The conquerors brought with them their local crops and animals to their colonies to be domesticated. The displacement of the natives occurred in Greece, Germany, Philippines, and Indonesia. To farm or not to farm. Causes of the spread of food production. The shift in civilizations from hunting-gathering to farming did not happen overnight. It was a long and complicated process with many factors involved. Food production, after all, is not invented or discovered. It evolved over time. One reason for the shift is the extinction of wild animals. In Chapter 1, it was discussed how certain species have become extinct because of hunting. The natives only knew how to hunt for food, and so the time came when some mammals were exterminated. In Fertile Crescent, for example, the gazelles decreased hugely in numbers because they were the primary source of meat. In connection to this, ancestors found hunting less productive and turned their attention to the abundant plants in their surroundings. Climate change, for instance, made a positive effect and increased the area covered by cereals. And so the civilization at Fertile Crescent began to cultivate plants. They soon were able to include barley and wheat in the domestication. They became good at farming because they already found it more rewarding than hunting. The development of tools also was a major part in the shift to farming. After 11,000 BC, plant cultivation improved because the people started creating more complex tools. Examples of which are sickles for harvest, baskets for bringing the grains home, as well as mortar and pestle for the removal of husks. They also began the process of roasting grains to avoid them from sprouting, and then the grains were stored in underground pits for future consumption. This led to the shift from nomadic lifestyle to a sedentary one. Another factor is the chicken-egg relationship between food production and population density. Was there more food source that is why population increased? Or is it the development of the human skills and capabilities which led to the stabilizing of food production? For Jared Diamond, they are equally important, and they make up a cycle. The disadvantage, however, is that farmers who produce the food consume a very small amount. It was the leaders and the bureaucrats who consumed most of the food, though they have no involvement in the actual process. The last factor on food production is geography. In most regions, hunter-gatherers were displaced and soon eliminated by farmer societies adjacent to their community. This happened in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Meanwhile, some hunter-gatherers were able to adapt and become sedentary farmers themselves, like in Japan and Western Europe. However, there are those communities which are isolated from their neighbors, causing them to never learn of farming, some of which are the indigenous people of Australia and North America. How to make an almond. Causes of the spread of food production. How did the first farmers domesticate wild plants to produce edible and sustainable crops? Farm-to-table process seems understandable enough in the present times, but how did the ancestors distinguish what was poisonous? How did they choose which was good for cultivating and which could yield more food? Thus, the development of crop evolved for over centuries and involved certain stages. The first stage occurred in the Fertile Crescent, which is bountiful with barley, peas, and wheat. Plants like these, even from the wild, were readily edible and high-yielding. They could be sowed and harvested easily within few months. And unlike lettuce and strawberries, they could be stored. The second stage was around 4000 BC, when nut trees and some fruits began to be domesticated. However, plants like olives, grapes, and pomegranates require 3 years in order to mature and bear fruits. And it takes 10 years for them to produce enough for subsistence. Farmers were able to ensure productivity due to the process of cutting, wherein they plant stems coming from the same fruitful trees. The third stage was the growth of fruit trees like cherry, pear, and apple. They were harder to cultivate because they involved grafting, which results in a wide variety of fruits. Experimentation was needed so that trees which yielded more would be distinguished from those which were not so fruitful. Furthermore, these fruit trees had to be cross-pollinated, which delayed their cultivation. Food sources in the Fertile Crescent, as well as in the other civilizations, were a combination of grains and legumes. Carbohydrates were provided by plants like corn, rice, and barley, while protein was acquired from soybeans and peas. In some regions, fields were only planted with a single kind of crop. They were sowed with seeds and later on tilled by animals attached to plows. In others, however, there were almost no domesticated animals. Fields were tilled by hand and planted with multiple crops. Now, to answer how almonds came about, it is necessary to go back to the process of transforming wild plants to consumable crops. Almonds contain amygdalin, which is its raw bitter taste. This substance, when digested, breaks down to form cyanide, which is, of course, poisonous. Some almond trees possess a specific single gene which undergoes mutation, preventing the almonds from bearing amygdalin. Early farmers must have discovered the bitter taste unintentionally and started planting the seeds, which were not bitter. Initially, potatoes, watermelons, cabbages, and eggplants had the same property. They too underwent the same remedy. There are plants, however, which were never cultivated for food production, like, for example, oak trees, which have 3 disadvantages. First, it takes them decades to bear acorns. Second, squirrels consume so many acorns that humans did not have the chance to study them. Third, oaks also have the bitterness property. However, unlike in almonds, which are confined to a single gene, oaks have multiple genes with the bitterness property. This made the probability of finding non-bitter acorns very low. Apples or Indian? Why did peoples of some regions fail to domesticate plants? The rise of agriculture depended on 2 factors, namely local wild plants and the people themselves. In some regions, agriculture developed independently. In others, however, it developed much later because crops were only brought in by neighboring societies. A comparison between the Fertile Crescent and New Guinea provides the best example. The Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia is already rich with wild plants since prehistory. The interesting part is that 80% of the world's crops only come from 12 kinds of plant species. The majority of the wild plants are woody or inedible. The Fertile Crescent is abundant with all the 12 crop species. The cereal group is composed of sorghum, barley, rice, corn, and wheat. The tubers are sweet potato, manioc, and potato. The sugar group, meanwhile, consists of sugar beet and sugar cane. And finally, soybean makes up for the legume group. In addition to this, the climate of the Fertile Crescent is excellent for agriculture. It was the Mediterranean climate, which is characterized by long, dry, and hot summers, as well as long, wet, and mild winters. The indigenous plants have all adapted to it. Cereals and soybeans especially are produced annually because of the changing seasons. Thus, all the crops became highly productive. Another advantage of the Fertile Crescent is that the majority of its wild plants are self-pollinating. They are hermaphrodites. They don't need to cross-pollinate. They don't need contact with the opposite male or female species because they can pollinate themselves. At the same time, some wild plants are asexual, meaning they don't require pollination. They can be reproduced by planting the roots, grafting, or cutting. The result of the productivity in crops is that large mammal species like cows, pigs, sheep, and goat thrived. And so, they were all easily domesticated. Now, to go back to the factors of agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals affected the population, which is initially of hunter-gatherers. The rich Fertile Crescent directed its people to settle down and cultivate. They became sedentary and prospered as farmers, to the point that the crops and animals of the region spread all throughout Eurasia and Africa. In extreme contrast to the Fertile Crescent is New Guinea, wherein there were no local and readily available crops. There were also no domesticated large animals. This had a great impact on the population who lingered with hunting and gathering. New Guineans have no source for carbohydrates and protein, and so the children became thin but big-bellied. The adults, meanwhile, resorted to eating frogs, mice, and spiders. After a period of time, the sweet potato arrived to New Guinea from the Philippines. Although it provided people a sugar source, it is not enough to increase population density. The title of the chapter, Apples or Indians, derives from the shift of societies from nomadic to sedentary lifestyle. The Indians of America refused to leave hunting-gathering and start cultivating apples. Amidst the abundance of apples in their region, they opt not to farm and stay in permanent homes. Zebras, unhappy marriages, and the Anna Karenina principle. Why were most big wild mammal species never domesticated? Of all the animal species, only a few of them were domesticated. Interestingly, all of them are terrestrial, herbivores, and over 100 pounds. These are horses, goats, sheep, cows, and pigs. Originally from Eurasia, they spread all throughout the globe and remained as primary food sources in the present. There are also other domesticated animals which are limited only to specific regions. Nevertheless, they are also significant. These animals are the water buffalo, reindeer, camel, yak, donkey, llama, gar, and bentang. Jared Diamond's definition of the Karenina principle is the fact that the successful domestication of animals in Eurasia involves certain criteria, and not even one of them can be missed. First is that some regions failed to domesticate their indigenous animals. Examples of these are the buffaloes and zebras of Africa. The hunter-gatherer population of Africa only learned how to herd when the 5 major animals of Eurasia were brought to them. Another factor is the human inclination to pets. The tamed cheetahs of Assyrians and Egyptians are examples, as well as the elephants of Asia. These animals underwent the first step of domestication. They were brought home from the wild, but they were not involved in agriculture. Next is that the trend of domestication stopped at 2500 BC. The ancestors must have tried to domesticate all 148 species of large animals, but the majority was never tamed. Cheetahs and elephants are also included on this list. The result is that the same set of few large animals has been domesticated over the course of time and all around the world. Until now, in the modern times, no other animals have been domesticated. Diamond went on to discuss in detail why is it that only 14 species of animals are involved in food production. He listed 6 reasons. Number 1 is diet. Domesticated animals are all herbivores. A farmer can sustain them by only providing grass or corn. Number 2 is growth rate. Farm animals grow quickly. A farmer will have to wait 15 years if he ever tries to breed elephants or gorillas. Number 3 is reproduction. Certain animals like cheetahs do not like to make sexual intercourse while being watched. Thus, they cannot be bred in farms. Number 4 is temperament. Other large mammals like the grizzly bear are very dangerous to humans. They can kill their captors in no time. Zebras are also a good example. Africans tried to hitch them with carts so they could be draft animals, but they failed. Zebras don't like to be tied, and they will not let go after biting a person. Number 5 is panic. Deer and antelope have flight instinct, so no farmer can ever get near them. Goats and sheep, meanwhile, are the exact opposites. And finally, number 6 is social structure. Domesticated animals exist in herds and they have a leader. Horses, for example, have a hierarchy. They all follow the alpha male. Since humans are more superior, the alpha male follows the farmer. By consequence, the whole herd follows as well. Domesticated animals are also non-territorial. Since they were young, they became accustomed to other animals. They can coexist with other species in a farm and, of course, to humans. The reason why cats are not bred in farms is because they are very territorial and never submissive to humans. Spacious skies and tilted axes. Why did food production spread at different rates on different continents? Jared Diamond strongly believed that geography is fundamental to the development of civilizations. Where continents lie in relation to latitude affects, in a great expense, its potential for food production. A quick look at a world map will reveal a stark difference with the geography of the Fertile Crescent as compared to Africa or America. The continents differ in axis orientation. The Fertile Crescent has an east-west axis. Its landmass is larger in width rather than length. Because almost the whole region lies in the same latitude, the climate is the same everywhere. That's why the major crops from the Fertile Crescent spread throughout the entire region. Thus, food production as a whole prospered, which is the foundation of a stable society. In contrast, Africa has a north-south axis. The crops from Fertile Crescent prospered in Egypt. However, downwards to Ethiopia, which is characterized by highlands, all the cereals failed to develop. Ethiopia lies in lower latitude than Egypt, and the climate there is not suitable for wheat or barley. In sub-Saharan Africa, however, wild plants were domesticated because of the summer rains and warm temperature. Yams and sorghum, which are indigenous to West Africa and the Sahel zone, became bountiful. Horses, which also came from the Fertile Crescent, never thrived south of the equator. It took centuries before goats, sheep, and cattle were domesticated in South Africa. This is also the case in America. Potatoes, guinea pigs, and llamas were domesticated in Mexico highlands with its cold climate. They are also suitable for the southern part of the Andes because of its similarity in latitude and climate. However, these crops and animals did not spread northward to Central America with its hot lowlands. On the other hand, sunflower and turkeys from Mexico thrived north of the Andes, but not southward because of the tropical climate. Therefore, crop diffusion in Central and South America became very selective and slow. From food to guns, germs, and steel. Lethal gift of livestock. The evolution of germs. Disease played an important part in history, especially at the age of colonization. The downfall of the Inca Empire was ensured by the outbreak of smallpox. As discussed in Chapter 3, the conquistador Francisco Pizarro killed Atahualpa, the emperor in the central city of Cajamarca. Smallpox sealed his victory when it claimed the life of the successor, Huayna Capac, in 1526. The disease also diminished a huge percent of the Inca population, which made it easier to be invaded. Smallpox and other infectious diseases had its roots from agriculture. When the societies shifted from hunting-gathering to sedentary living, the farmers lived in homes with sewage systems. Their drinking water became contaminated. Farmers also used their own waste as fertilizer, which initiated direct contact with germs. Fishing also had its disadvantages. The bodies of water became breeding ground for snails, which carry parasites. Because of food storage, farmers also became prone to diseases from rodents. The spread of disease was made even worse by the increase of human population. Furthermore, the developments of trade routes, amidst all its advantages to the world, made easier the transmission of disease among continents. The bubonic plague reached Europe in 1346 via a trade route to China. It was a disease that originated with fleas in the furs of rats. Because of Eurasia's east-west axis orientation, the bubonic plague soon spread all throughout Europe, wiping out 1/4 of its population. Thus, one of the most tragic events in history occurred, famously known as the Black Death. Bubonic plague is an example of epidemic disease. Epidemics are characterized by a sudden wave of infected cases and then nothing for a long period of time. It is fast-spreading and acute, meaning that once a person acquires the disease, death is immediate. There are some people, however, who recover and become immune. Their genes made them able to develop antibodies, which can overpower the disease. The survivors of the Black Death, for example, passed on their genes to their descendants. This immunity made the succeeding generations healthier and stronger. In the present times, the possibility of a similar outbreak is less likely. This is because of the invention of vaccines and the general improvement in the study of medicine. However, transmission of bacteria or virus from animals is still inevitable at some point because of pets. Blueprints and borrowed letters. The evolution of writing. The development of writing is one of the hallmarks of ancient civilizations. It shaped societies then and continues to do so today. For the colonizers, it is what separates them from the barbarians of their colonies. Knowledge gave them power. Through books, Hernán Cortés had knowledge of what to expect of the Aztecs. On the other hand, Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, thought he was a reincarnation of the god Tenochtitlan. Together with disease, weapons, politics, and religion, writing became a vital part of colonization. Sumerians of the Fertile Crescent were the first civilization to develop a system of writing. It came about with the need of farmers to tally their crops or sheep. They drew symbols on clay tablets. Thus, the oldest writing system, called cuneiform, was invented. Writing was also developed independently in Mesoamerica, Egypt, and China. All the other systems of writing were actually derivations of cuneiform and the Mayan. The reason for this is that inventing an independent system takes hundreds of years, as with the Sumerians. It is a tedious process, and besides, the possibility for other people to create a new one was preempted by the existing systems. And so, writing systems spread out to neighboring regions by way of copying or modification, and also by idea diffusion. That is, other peoples derived the basic idea from existing forms and then reinvented the details. The problem is that some societies were isolated geographically, so the diffusion of ideas became very slow. This goes also for spread of technology or culture, like, for example, in the Polynesian Islands. The development of writing reiterates the importance of access orientation. Productive agriculture brought forward the necessity of writing. Necessity's mother. The evolution of technology. There are various economic and ideological factors involved in the rise of technology. In association with geography, there are 4 factors, namely war, climate, scarcity, and political stability. The world witnessed a great leap in technology with the invention of trucks and planes in the First World War. After several years, nuclear weapons were invented in the Second World War. Climate is also a huge factor. Winter season brought forward the necessity of warm clothes and crop preservation in some countries. The abundance or scarcity of resources also determines advances in technology. In Northern Europe, the existence of many rivers brought the need for water mills. Meanwhile, the destruction of forests in Great Britain meant the early development of coal technology. Political stability plays a part as well. China experienced a technological downfall in the 1500s because of change in trade policy. On the other hand, Japan underwent modernization in the 1800s with the Meiji Restoration. The same also goes for Germany, which became a single nation in 1871. Sometimes, advancement in technology happens independently within regions, an example of which is pottery. It arose independently in Japan 14,000 years ago, and in China 10,000 years ago. The Japanese and the Chinese must have observed the clay's behavior and came up with the idea. Sometimes innovation spread from one region to another through borrowing or idea diffusion, best example of which is the wheel. In the Old World, wheels were only solid circles fastened together. The idea of wheels spread all throughout the globe until it was reinvented by the use of spokes. Moreover, new inventions lead to more inventions. The movable printing was first invented in China. Later on, it reached Europe, which led to the invention of printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in 1455. Of course, earlier inventions such as paper and ink made it possible as well. In some regions, new inventions from other places were immediately adapted and well received. However, some societies are isolated, like for example the Aboriginals of Tasmania. The island, which is 100 miles from Australia, had no technology aside from what they've invented. This is because they had 10,000 years of complete isolation from other societies. From egalitarianism to kleptocracy. The evolution of government and religion. There are 4 classifications of society. They are state, chiefdom, tribe, and band. Their politics, economics, and social structure differ from one another. All great civilizations must have begun as bands. These small societies are formed by an extended family with a population of only 80 people at most. They still do exist in Amazonia and New Guinea. But other bands have already been assimilated by the state, like, for example, the Eskimos or Inuit, the Aboriginal Australians, or the Pygmies of Africa. Bands are characterized by nomadic lifestyle and reliance on hunting-gathering. There are also no formal institutions or social hierarchy. All affairs were discussed by everybody to reach a decision. The term for this is egalitarianism. Tribes are formed by hundreds of people who share the same language or culture. They began to emerge in the Fertile Crescent. Tribal members are all acquainted with one another, and they live a sedentary lifestyle through agriculture. Like bands, tribes are also egalitarian. Chiefdoms already existed in the Fertile Crescent by 5500 BC, and in Mesoamerica by 1000 BC. Their population may reach 10,000 and more. For the first time in history, a formal form of government was needed to prevent unrelated individuals to have disputes. The chief has the sole authority. The commoners, meanwhile, work at the farms, craft tools, or build infrastructure. They create artifacts, temples, and buildings at the command of the chief. Thus, kleptocracy began wherein there was a huge imbalance with the wealth of the upper class as compared to the commoners. States have all the formal institutions that the other forms of society do not have. It has a centralized government with leaders and many levels of bureaucracy. There is a definite set of laws and judges to enforce them. The food production is intensive, and wealth is redistributed via paying taxes. To maintain their position and to prevent them from being overthrown, the elites had to gain the public support. First was through arming themselves and disarming the common people. Therefore, the production of weapons was monopolized by the elites. Second was by keeping the masses happy by redistributing some amount of the goods. Third was through assuring public order and providing security. Fourth was by creating a single religion or ideology that would embody the values of the state. To conclude, the need for complex societies was initiated by the increase in population, which, in turn, was caused by stable food production. Around the World in 5 Chapters. Yali's People. The Histories of Australia and New Guinea. Before the Ice Age, Australia and New Guinea formed a single continent called Greater Australia. When the ice melted, the Arafura Sea came about to separate them. Though New Guinea had contact with Indonesia, it abruptly stopped, leaving Yali's people isolated. There was a resemblance in genetic appearance between New Guineans and Southeast Asians, but it was changed when immigrants from southern China came to the Philippines and eventually to Indonesia. They may have been parts of a greater continent, but Australia and New Guinea's geography is very different from one another. Australia has a dry, temperate climate. Its land is mostly flat, while its soil is dry and infertile. New Guinea, on the other hand, is near the equator. The land is wet and very fertile. Its terrain, meanwhile, is rugged and mountainous. Wild plants such as sugarcane, bananas, yams, and taro were abundant there. If so, why did New Guinea fail to develop political and social organizations as well as modern technology? First, amidst the abundant crops in New Guinea, there was almost no source of protein. The only animals domesticated there were chickens and pigs, animals which can't pull carts or help in the fields. Second, because of the mountainous terrain, agriculture was limited to lowland slash and burn. The mountains also became hindrance to the spread of ideas and contacts between tribes. Third, New Guinea was isolated from its 3 neighboring countries by huge bodies of water. The Austronesian Expansion reached Indonesia and boosted its development in 1600 BC. However, these were not spread out to New Guinea, because the Portuguese landed in the Moluccas by 1511. The overall result is that hunter-gatherer societies still exist in New Guinea up until today, and the Aboriginals of Australia share the same fate. How China became Chinese. The history of East Asia. Unlike United States or Russia, China had already been united since 221 BC. Though it has a population of 1.2 billion, 800 million Chinese speak Mandarin, and the other 300 million speak similar languages. However, like any other nation, China also had its own obstacles. It may not be well known, but there is a distinction between North Chinese and South Chinese. The Northerners possess more pointed nose and smaller eyes. They are heavier, taller, and paler. They also resemble the people of Nepal and Tibet. The Southerners, meanwhile, look more like the Filipinos and Vietnamese. The North and the South also differ in climate and environment. North China is colder and drier, while South China is hotter and wetter. Nevertheless, China has an east-west axis, which made agriculture flourish. Early evidences of food production were found all over the country. Millet species, which are drought-resistant, grew in North China, and rice flourished in South China. Archaeologists also found bones of domesticated animals like chickens, dogs, and pigs. Silkworms, ducks, geese, and water buffalo were also important. Ancient Chinese farmers also planted pears, peaches, citrus, apricots, tea, and soybeans. As a result of stable food production, other developments followed. Xia, the first dynasty, was also founded around 2000 BC. At the time when Southeast Asians were only hunter-gatherers, Chinese had already started processing bronze and iron. They had already invented gunpowder, the wheelbarrow, compass, and paper. It is even likely that influenza originated in China because of the widespread cultivation of pigs. The rulers commanded the commoners to build big palaces, defensive walls, and the Grand Canal linking the north and the south. By 400 BC, societies within the country began to interact with each other, gradually forming the Chinese culture. Also fundamental to China's unification, aside from agriculture, are the 2 great rivers. Both the Yellow River and the Yangtze River provided coast to inner-land transportation of goods and technology. They were witness to the exchange between the North and South China. China began to influence Korea and Japan from 200 BC, when the 2 countries adopted rice. Within the next centuries, they also began with bronze metallurgy and writing. Until now, the alphabets of Korea and Japan still contain a few Chinese characters. However, because of geography, both countries were not absorbed by China. Each developed its own strong society with unique culture and form of government. Speedboat to Polynesia. The history of the Austronesian Expansion. The Austronesian Expansion began in Taiwan and spread throughout Southeast Asia. It even reached Madagascar in Africa and all of Polynesia. Strong genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence supports it. Originally, it was Negritos who inhabited the Philippines, but they were displaced and reduced to a small number by the expansion. The Negritos have dark skin and tightly curled hair. They are now only limited to remote areas in the Philippines today, and they lost their original language. The reason for Philippines and Indonesia being easily affected by the Austronesian expansion is because these nations were not yet unified by the time. Unlike China, the 2 countries were still composed of smaller and separate states by then. The Austronesians were actually from Taiwan. They are expert seafarers with their superb canoes and navigation skills. That's why their expansion reached far off. Their language is the most widespread in the whole world. Austronesian was the basis for around 1,200 languages spoken by 350 million people today. This is the reason why a lot of words with the same meaning are shared by the Indonesians and Filipinos. Some examples are aku, ako, meaning I, anak, meaning child, and cocolat, tsokolat, meaning chocolate. Southeast Asians, Polynesians, and the people of Madagascar share the same physical traits. Indonesia and Philippines also inherited the pottery making of the South Chinese. However, New Guineans have no resemblance whatsoever with Austronesians, whether in physical appearance or language. Though they have learned pottery, their products are non-functional and only for aesthetics. The art of pottery did not spread in New Guinea and is only limited to some groups. Hemispheres colliding. The histories of Eurasia and the Americas compared. The continents of Eurasia and America differ with each other in so many ways. These differences define what they are today. One is the availability of wild animals. Eurasia is abundant with large mammals like cows and goats, which aside from their meat can provide milk. Water buffaloes can help the farmer to plow the land. Horses can carry loads and serve as transportation. Also, they are excellent for warfare. All of these animals are not indigenous to America. The only animals available are llamas and alpacas. Though they can provide wool, meat, and transportation, they're not good for pulling plows or carts. Furthermore, they also cannot be used for warfare. Another discrepancy is the kinds of indigenous plants. The Native Americans had so much dependence on corn, which is low in protein. Food production in Europe relied heavily on high-protein cereals like barley and wheat. They are abundant in Europe, and they do not need to be planted by hand. Their seeds can be thrown off the fields and they would grow. With the availability of large mammals, the fields of Eurasia do not need to be tilled by hand. The animals can be attached to plows, and they can also pull carts, which saves a lot of human effort. Their manure can fertilize the soil and make it healthier, all of which did not materialize in Native America. Even germs, which are a consequence of the farmer's long relationship with animals, originated in Eurasia. So when infectious disease reached the Americas, many natives died because they were unfamiliar and unaccustomed to the germs. As a consequence of high-yielding food production, a greater part of the population was freed from the task of looking for food. Native Americans, on the other hand, were mostly hunter-gatherers. The disadvantage was that all individuals must find food for almost every meal. This became a huge hindrance for the development of writing, technology, political, and social structure. The comparison in the field of technology between America and Eurasia can be seen with the development of metals, weapons, machines, wheels, and ships. Metals like copper, bronze, and iron were widely used in Eurasia in the production of various tools. In the Americas, however, only copper is present, but it was preceded by the use of bones, wood, and stone as primary tools. Even weapons are more advanced in Eurasia. Blacksmiths were able to master the art of making chainmails, helmets, daggers, lances, and swords, which were used in the Age of Conquest. Moreover, the art of gun and artillery making also flourished in Europe. On the contrary, the Native Americans only had clubs or axes, which were made from wood and stones. Horses also gave a big military advantage to the Europeans with their speed and height. The simple tools of the Native Americans had no match with the army and cavalry of the colonizers. Machines had its beginnings with the use of donkeys, horses, and cattle in pulling plows and turning wheels. European farmers utilized the power of these animals to grind grain, get water, and irrigate the fields. While in America, everything is still being done manually. As early as the medieval times, the technology of wheels was combined with animal, wind, and water power, not only in farming but also in manufacture. Thus, the production of sugar, salt, textiles, and paper was made possible. By 1492, machines and manufacture were widely spread all throughout Europe. While in America, manual labor still dominated. Manufacturing, of course, has the technology of steel at its foundation. Europeans also became expert seafarers with their superb navigation and ship-making skills. Their large ships were equipped with compasses and cannons when they crossed the oceans to reach new territory. When Francisco Pizarro made his voyage to Peru, he captured some natives in their rafts, which are the only mode of sea transport for the natives. The colonizers also had a big advantage in the form of writing. Leaders, along with bureaucrats, were able to facilitate trade and governance through literacy. Because the Native Americans were almost completely illiterate, they didn't have the information about the foreigners and about their place of origin. They became vulnerable and subject to deception. And so, with all these advances, the great empires of Aztecs and Inca fell to the hands of the conquerors. From 1492 to 1666, 6 states of Europe, namely Denmark, Sweden, France, England, Portugal, and Spain, had the capabilities to conquer the chiefdoms, tribes, and bands of North America. They continued to explore and acquire new territory on strange lands through guns, germs, and steel. How Africa became black. The history of Africa. There are a number of amazing facts to be known about Africa. One is that the continent had 1,500 different languages, and another is that Africans are not all black. This diversity resulted from a long prehistory and varying geography. By 1000 AD, there were 5 major races in Africa. First, interestingly, are the white Africans. According to Jared Diamond, this is not surprising because of North Africa's vicinity to Southwest Asia and Europe, which also have the similar race. Second is the Asian Africans of Madagascar. These people are distinctly of Southeast Asian origin because of the Austronesian Expansion. They share the same culture, genetics, and language as Southeast Asia. The 3 remaining major groups of people are interrelated with one another. The blacks of Africa occupied the largest area even as early as 1400 AD. They cover most of the sub-Saharan Africa and depended on farming and herding. Pygmies and Khoisan, on the other hand, are hunter-gatherers. Pygmies of Central Africa are similar to African blacks, but their skin is more reddish. Their facial and body hair is also more extensive. They also have more prominent teeth, eyes, and forehead. The Khoisan, meanwhile, have yellowish skin and more tightly coiled hair. Their women tend to have steatophagia, or excessive fat in the buttocks. The question of why Africa became black is because of the Bantu expansion. Bantu language is a sub-branch of the Niger-Congo language. It spread out through the sub-equational Africa over the course of history. The Bantu expansion represents the indirect cause and effect relationship of latitude, agriculture, and population. The continent of Africa has a north-south orientation. Domesticated plants and animals from Europe thrived in North Africa, but not anymore below the equator. This is because of a sharp difference in climate. This is why the Khoisan and Pygmies remained as hunter-gatherers. Their land is incompatible with agriculture. On the other hand, the blacks are lucky to be occupying Cameroon and Nigeria, lands with nurturing climate. Because of stable food production, they engulfed the Khoisan and Pygmy population over the course of time. The language spoken by the blacks is Bantu, which is a subpart of the Niger-Congo language group, thus the Bantu expansion. As a result, the Pygmies have not yet developed a distinct language of their own. Meanwhile, the Khoisan are still using their unique click language. In the present, however, both tribal groups make up only a small percentage of the demography of Africa. The future of human history as a science. There is a saying that the study of history is just one damn fact after another. With this book, it has been proven false. The difference of history from science is that it allows no general principles or laws. More specifically, the 2 fields differ from methodology, causation, prediction, and complexity. Controlled experiments cannot be done with history. Variables such as humans or events can never be manipulated to arrive at a conclusion. History is instead a chain of direct and indirect causes, all interrelated with one another. A society, for example, cannot be studied like atoms in quantum mechanics. People don't follow specific laws that will predict their future behavior. Human beings, of course, are more complex than atoms. So the solution is by way of natural experiments. By studying events of the past, they can be compared to what is happening in the present, so that history won't repeat itself. In a way, natural experiments are also used in the branches of science such as paleontology, geology, ecology, climatology, astronomy, and evolutionary biology. Jared Diamond hopes that history may be studied like science in the future. After all, the word science derived from the Latin scientia, which means knowledge. Jared Diamond provided an in-depth discussion of why it was Europeans who colonized the world and not the other way around. It was all because of, as Diamond puts it, geographical accident. Europeans are lucky enough to live in a continent with an east-west axis. All regions of Europe have the same Mediterranean climate, which is very suitable for agriculture. Thus, food production becomes abundant. As a consequence, there became an increase in population, which required social structure. The British and the French, for example, have built their own kingdoms. They have farmers who produce food for the whole population. They also have artisans to create tools for the improvement of food production. Their kings and queens became free to focus on politics inside the kingdom, and later on, outside through the colonies. All other developments, such as writing and infectious disease, are indirect effects of agriculture. To conclude, it was not the colonized people who were lacking, but their lands instead. New Guineans are no less intelligent than Europeans. They had their own way of life. It's just that they were not lucky enough to have the proper resources to improve further. But once crops or animals from Europe were brought to the colonies, they prospered in their own pace. However, there are only a selected number of species which are suitable to a certain climate. All of these disadvantages, nevertheless, must not hinder the third world countries or the former colonies to develop. It is true that colonization has deep and long-term effects, but it depends on the relatively young nations to endure and improve. Around the world today, colonization is not fully eliminated. It has evolved and taken new forms. Some mother nations still have effects of varying degree to their former colonies. They still influence, whether in politics, society, economy, or culture of the third world. But as sovereign nations, it's up to the colonized people to strengthen their national identity and secure their sovereignty. After all, there may be limits to the land, but not with the human spirit.